Welcome to the first in a series of retrospective videos on IDW's Transformers comics, stretching from 2005 to 2018 and producing over 350 plus issues, including all the different series, annuals, and one-shots. This continuity is the longest running Transformers comic series, and probably the most popular one as well. Though there were undeniably ups and downs, these comics will always have a special place in my heart. I was born in the early 80s, and I've been a Transformers fan for pretty much as long as I can remember. I grew up with the original toys, issues of the Marvel comic, and VHS copies of the cartoon and the animated movie. Something about the brand has staying power for me in a way that none of the other stuff I liked as a kid has been able to replicate, so I remained a fan for pretty much my whole life. There were lapses here and there, but I always kept coming back to the brand in some way over the years. IDW's Transformers comics brought me back into the fold big time, and I still consider this expansive run to be the most interesting and richly crafted collection of Transformers stories to date. I've wanted to do something focusing on these comics for a while now, and wrestled with what format to go with for a bit before finally turning away from the blog format I was initially envisioning, landing instead on a video series. With how long this run lasted, I'm not sure how many videos it'll take to get through everything, but my plan is to do all of the stories that are considered canon in that continuity from start to finish. The aim of what I want to do is to get into what I see when I think about how these comics work or don't work, highlight notes of interest that stand out to me, and give some historical context where appropriate. Now, in order to best do that, I think it's necessary that we're all on the same page in terms of the story being told. And after a short introduction, I'll give a synopsis of each arc in the hopes of having a basic framework to build from during my analysis. And as far as the order is going to go, you can think of this as my recommended reading order for this continuity. That ends up being mostly publication order, although arranged in such a way that'll make for a coherent reading experience. There are definitely points when I'll have to make adjustments just so everything makes sense. Now, I'm doing it this way because it's my preferred way to experience these stories. I've tried it other ways. I've read through the whole thing chronologically, as well as using IDW's recommended reading order as outlined in their hardcover collections. But I think with both of those approaches, you miss the historical context for how the continuity was conceived and how that changed and evolved over time. Ultimately, what my approach means is that a series like Megatron Origin or Spotlight issues like Spotlight Blur that were published later on in the run but take place earlier in the in-universe timeline will be presented later to line up in the order they were published, effectively making these flashback stories, which I think is fine since this continuity is pretty flashback heavy as it is. One final note about how I'm approaching this thing. As you can see in the video title, this retrospective will be broken up into 3 phases to match the official divisions of the different eras. Naturally, we're starting with Phase 1, which lasted from October of 2005 to December of 2011. Just to make matters more complicated, Phase 1 can actually be divided further into sub-phases, defined by the directions taken by the creative teams at the time. There are different ways you could do this, but I prefer to view Phase 1 as being made up of 2 major sub-phases. One led by Simon Furman that spanned 55 canon issues, or 59, depending if you consider New Avengers and Transformers canon, which we'll get there. 44 of which were written by Furman himself, including a shared story credit with Klaus Chervinsky for Spotlight Wheelie, and the other big subphase, with Mike Costa at the helm, produced 55 canon issues, 34 of which were written by Costa, including 4 writing credits shared with James Roberts during the Chaos storyline. Bridging the divide between these 2 eras is the All Hail Megatron event series, spearheaded by Shane McCarthy, yielding 21 total issues with 15 regular-sized issues and 1 shorter coda story written by McCarthy himself. As should be expected with this sort of turnover among creative teams, as well as perhaps differing editorial philosophies, the storyline of Phase 1, when taken as a whole, feels disjointed and inconsistent at times, which is perhaps fitting for a series that didn't have the anchor of a proper monthly ongoing title until Transformers #1 was finally published in 2009. Nevertheless, IDW accomplished what they set out to do, reimagining the original premise of the Transformers franchise for the modern day, in this case, the early 2000s. As such, the civil war between the Autobots and Decepticons is featured prominently in Phase 1, with Earth being the planet where the balance of power shifts irrevocably. Some of the significant stories from Phase 1 include the Autobots' first brush with Nemesis Prime and the Dead Universe, Megatron's attempted conquest of Earth, and Overlord's takeover of the Autobot prison Garrus 9, prompting a response by the Wreckers. And that is, of course, just a taste. There's much more going on in Phase 1, but this broad overview isn't the place to get into it. Rest assured, I'll dive into it all in more detail once we get there in the sequence of videos. The big thing about these first stories in Phase 1 that I want to stress is that Simon Furman and the artists he worked with during this time created the universe from the ground up, established the tone, and set the bar for the storytelling throughout the entire 13-year IDW run. Not to dismiss the impact of the many great stories told by subsequent creators who left their own distinctive mark in their own right, but there's just no getting around the fact that the success of those later stories all owe a great debt to these early tales, which would prove to be the foundation for everything that followed. Anyway, I think that's enough about that, so let's turn our attention to the first story arc, which is Infiltration. And this is going all the way back to the very beginning of the IDW run, back to the year 2005, which, let's face it, it's a good year for anything Transformers related to come out. And it was certainly an interesting year. One that kicked off a lot of pop culture stuff that would live on in the cultural zeitgeist for years afterwards. And just to name a few, 2005 marked the debut of the US version of The Office on NBC, Christopher Nolan's first Batman film, Batman Begins, hit theaters. Kanye West was just developing his taste for controversy.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
A little site called YouTube was brought online and, much like Skynet may one day kill us all, and on a much smaller scale of cultural impact, Transformers Issue 0 was published in October of that year. And keep in mind that at the time, the first Michael Bay Transformers movie had yet to be released. So while the brand was still chugging along, it was not in the position it was after the release of the live-action film in 2007. Generation 1, for that matter, didn't have as much of a presence in Hasbro's toy catalog of 2005 as it does nowadays. And as an aside for those that might not know, I think the simplest definition for the at first unofficial then later official term Generation 1, or G1 for short, is that it's really just shorthand for the products sold during the formative years of the Transformers brand, usually specified as the original toy line, the Marvel Comics, and the Sunbow cartoon. As some Transformers fans may know, the concept is more complicated and sometimes more contentious than that, but I think that if you're not familiar with the term, the easy definition I've given is all you really need to know for when it comes up in these videos. But the point is, in 2005, Generation 1 was more at the periphery, complementing the other Transformers toys that were being rolled out rather than being at the center of the brand like it is today. Despite that, there was still clearly some interest in that slice of the franchise. Enough for Hasbro to put out some reissues of the G1 toys and for Dreamwave Productions to maintain a line of G1 Transformers comics that had launched a few years prior. However much interest there might have been in those comics at the time, it wasn't enough to solve the deeper systemic issues at Dreamwave. The extremely short version is that the creators stopped getting paid and the publishers went bankrupt in January of 2005, bringing an abrupt end to the G1 comic universe they were creating. Hasbro then took the license to IDW Publishing. With those Dreamwave stories still fresh in the minds of fans, IDW knew they had to try something different. To kick things off, they brought in longtime Transformers writer Simon Furman to create a new take on the Transformers. Furman had been a writer for the original G1 comics, as well as the sequel series Generation 2 during the Marvel Comics days, and his run had, in many ways, like Chris Claremont and the Uncanny X-Men, or Larry Hama with G.I. Joe, become a defining moment of the history of Transformers comics. Furman had also been writing more recent comics for Dreamwave Productions, so he was plenty warmed up to revisit those Generation 1 characters. Not that Furman wouldn't be making some changes, mind you. In a brief interview included at the end of issue 0, Furman says his goal with Infiltration was to update and modernize the G1 concept, which meant not only rethinking many of the alternate modes of various characters, but also rethinking why the Transformers were on Earth, how long they'd been there, the nature of their civil war, and so on. As I mentioned, the book dropped in October of 2005, subtitled Prelude to Infiltration. It was kind of presented as something of a teaser for the 6-part series that would begin in earnest in January 2006. It is actually a pretty essential part of the story. It's the first part of the chapter and introduces the whole setup and the characters that you need moving forward with Infiltration number 1. Speaking of those stories and characters, let's go ahead and dive into greater detail there with a synopsis of Infiltration's 7-issue arc. At a bus station in Phoenix, Arizona, a teenage runaway named Verity Carlo is scoping out things she can steal to maintain or enhance her vagabond lifestyle. One of these items is an SM-40 Palm computer with a portable modem in the possession of a middle-aged man whom Verity takes for a traveling salesman. As proud as she is of her observational prowess, Verity is oblivious to the fact that the middle-aged man and his computer are also being targeted by Decepticons, specifically the battle chargers Runamuck and Runabout, disguised as Earth vehicles. After swiping the SM-40 device while the owner naps, Verity feigns a stomach upset to get off the bus and away from the scene of the crime, hitching a ride with a young man named Hunter O'Neill. Hunter is a conspiracy theorist who runs a website devoted to uncovering evidence that the world has secretly been invaded by giant robots, but nobody noticed because they're in disguise. The Decepticons are after the data on the Palm computer Verity stole, and after running the bus off the road and killing the owner, or as they put it, sanitizing the target, they find that something they refer to as the data cache isn't present, so they spread out and locate Hunter and Verity, joined in short order by the Seeker Thundercracker. The duo narrowly escape being sanitized by Thundercracker twice over, the second instance due to the timely intervention of Autobot medic Ratchet, who fends off the Decepticons in vehicular combat. At this point, while it's clear that there are strange things afoot with these vehicles having all these guns and weapons and secret compartments, the Autobots and Decepticons haven't revealed themselves to be giant robots just yet, with Ratchet attempting to maintain cover using a fairly unconvincing thing called a hollow matter avatar, which is a kind of dynamic hologram that is able to interact with the physical world. All of this feeds back into the robots in disguise concept, where both factions are waging their war on alien worlds in secret, maintaining strict forms of cover in the early stages of invasion. Having shaken the Decepticons and needing repairs, Verity, Hunter, and Ratchet stop in Riverside, California to connect with a mechanic named Jimmy Pink, a guy Verity knows from online interactions and who she refers to as a net hiker. I don't think net hiker was ever a thing, even in the year 2005. Anyway, in an attempt to get some answers, Hunter secretly takes the SM-40, booting it up to examine its contents, which inadvertently leads the Decepticons right to their location. We finally get to see the bot modes for the battle chargers and Ratchet, although only briefly before they resume cover and another chase ensues, culminating with the 3 humans and Ratchet being rescued by Prowl, Ironhide, and Sunstreaker. This is far from a warm reunion amongst comrades, however, as Prowl details a laundry list of infractions and violations Ratchet has committed by bringing Verity, Hunter, and Jimmy into direct contact with the Autobot-Decepticon war. This sets up a recurring conflict between the 2 Autobot characters throughout Infiltration, with Prowl being more of a cold, calculating force devoted to regulations and the greater good, while Ratchet's top priority is saving individual lives, regardless of what the rules say. Not only that, but Ratchet believes he's uncovered something big going on, evidenced by the Decepticons engaging in siege mode unexpectedly, as well as Thundercracker, Runabout, and Runamuck going to extreme lengths to bury and guard whatever's hidden on the SM-40 device. Prowl is dismissive of Ratchet's claims, and once they've returned to Arc-19, the Autobots' hidden base underneath Lake Michigan, tasks him only with downloading the data off the portable device and returning the humans to their normal lives. I mentioned siege mode, and that all ties into this idea of infiltration protocol, standard operating procedure when Decepticons invade a planet in an attempt to conquer it and strip it of resources. As Ratchet says, the Decepticons are specialists in infiltration. They dig in and then slowly destabilize the geopolitical infrastructure, fomenting global anarchy. While not expressly stated here, Ratchet is talking about Phase 1 of the Decepticons' infiltration protocol. And as an aside, this is where all the phase stuff in the collected edition branding comes from. So anyway, Siege Mode is a protective military configuration that typically occurs in Phase 5. The different phases are fairly vague at this point in the chronology, and when Jimmy asks if there's a Phase 6, Ratchet assures the human that he's better off not knowing. Foreshadowing alert. What's perplexing Ratchet, and most likely leading Prowl to dismiss the medic's concern, is that it's too early in the game for Siege Mode in Phase 5. Not only that, but the Decepticons appear to have 2 command bunkers, a current one in Oregon and an abandoned one in Nebraska that the deceased owner of the SM-40 managed to infiltrate and photograph. The existence of a second bunker is unusual, prompting the question, why did the Decepticons up and leave for the West Coast? That's a question that Hunter, Verity, and Jimmy are determined to answer by trying as hard as they can to convince Ratchet to let them help. Although Ratchet is reluctant to put the humans in harm's way again, Bumblebee convinces him that there's no other choice and volunteers to come along as backup. As the Autobots will soon uncover, the Decepticon infiltration unit on Earth has discovered a mysterious form of raw energon called Or-13. Or-13 will later be known by the nickname Ultra Energon, because it grants the user greater strength and power than they would normally possess. Starscream, the leader of the Decepticon unit on Earth, is planning to stage a coup by using Or-13 to usurp Megatron. The backstabbing Seeker commander knows it's just a matter of time until Megatron realizes the Decepticons have broken protocol on Earth and comes to intervene. To delay that process, thus buying more time to refine and synthesize Or-13, Starscream dispatches Skywarp and Blitzwing to destroy all evidence of their recent indiscretions, including the abandoned bunker in Nebraska, putting them on a collision course with our heroes. At the Nebraska bunker, Verity, Hunter, and Jimmy are sent in solo with scanners to investigate. It's never explained outright, but there are hints here and in the follow-up series Escalation that the Autobots can't enter the bunker, even with their hollow matter avatars, due to Decepticon traps and scanners specifically set for Cybertronians. Once inside, the three split up to cover more ground, while Bumblebee and Ratchet try and fail to take on the recently arrived Skywarp and Blitzwing. Hunter and Jimmy find jack shit in the bunker, but Verity discovers a mechanical tree-like device adorned with several empty pods, as well as one that has a dead body inside, which we'll learn more about later. Oh, and she also finds Megatron. Turns out the big bad arrived sooner than anyone anticipated, and Skywarp and Blitzwing unwittingly bury Megatron as they bomb the bunker from above until it caves in. Megatron's not down long, though, dispatching his wayward Decepticons with ease before departing for Oregon to deal with Starscream. After transmitting their findings to Prowl, Ratchet and the humans are effectively sidelined, sent back to Arc-19 while the rest of the Autobots head for the Oregon-based Decepticon command bunker to prevent the destruction from the mutiny within the Decepticon ranks from spilling over into a populated area. There ends up not being much danger of that, however, as Megatron swiftly puts down Starscream's little insurrection with little effort.
Good God, that's his spine.
Keep in mind that Starscream was hopped up on Ultra Energon at the time and still didn't seem to be capable of doing anything to Megatron other than irritating him. This gives us a taste of how insanely powerful Megatron is in this continuity, something that will continue to come up over the years, but right from the beginning, it's clear he was conceived as being almost unstoppable. With Megatron reclaiming control of Starscream's unit, the Decepticons return to their bunker, while the Autobots return to Arc-19. At long last, Prowl admits that Ratchet was right, and that it's time to call in the big guns. But it turns out, they've already arrived. However, there are more troubles on the horizon beyond Megatron and Or-13. The Autobots are no longer as hidden as they once were, having been observed re-entering Arc-19. Remember the guy Verity thought was a traveling salesman? The one with the SM-40 computer who started this whole mess? Well, he was a man who went by the alias of Finkelrock. But his name was actually Stoker, and he was an agent of the Machination, a clandestine organization hidden within a corporation named Epsilon Holdings, owned by Abraham Dante. The Machination has a serious interest in all things Cybertronian, hiring a man named Drake to lead a team tasked with locating and capturing a Transformer. By the end of this series, they get a big lead on where to get one. So that wraps up the summary for Infiltration's story. Now let's get into the finer details. This miniseries has a number of small nods, callbacks, references. So without further ado, here are some of the Easter eggs and nods that I noticed. During a flashback sequence in the first issue, the Mechatopia page provides some backstory as to the invasion conspiracy theories Hunter subscribes to. This text also teases future stories and characters, mentioning dinosaur variant mechanoids and the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1984, which, of course, is also a nod to the fictional Oregon volcano Mount St. Hilary, whose eruption revived the Autobots and Decepticons in the original cartoon and Marvel comic. Speaking of Mount St. Hilary, the Autobot and Decepticon bases in Infiltration seem to be a nod to the G1 cartoon, only flipped. In Infiltration, Arc 19 is located underwater, while the Decepticon siege mode bunker is built into an Oregon mountain. Whereas in the G1 cartoon, the Decepticon base was underwater and the Autobots' Arc was inside the mountain. And it's not a perfect one-to-one, but it seems too similar to be a coincidence. Then there's Finkelrock, the alias for the Machination agent Stoker used in issue number 3. This is a reference to 2 human characters from the Marvel US comic. The first is Donnie Finkelberg, a struggling comic book writer recruited by the Intelligence and Information Institute to masquerade as a villain named Robot Master to deceive the public about the Transformers. The other is wealthy industrialist Garrison Blackrock, who would ultimately form the Neo Knights, a team of superpowered individuals meant to defend Earth from Cybertronian threats. While not an explicit reference so much as more of a continuing tradition, Ratchet taking such a prominent role in Infiltration is reminiscent of how significant and memorable he was in the original Marvel comics under the pens of both Bob Budiansky and Simon Furman. In Budiansky's stories, Ratchet was the last Autobot standing on Earth after Shockwave defeated the others, prompting Ratchet to find a way to retake the Ark from the Decepticons and save his fellow Autobots. Furman, meanwhile, used the Autobot medic to usher in a new status quo as well as a new batch of toys, depicting Ratchet as a noble and selfless Autobot who sacrificed himself to turn the tide in the Autobots' favor, restoring his fallen allies by giving them new Pretender shells and taking Megatron off the battlefield. I've got to be honest, I get a big kick out of Hunter because there are a lot of interesting coincidences, you might say, with him that you could use to start connecting some pretty wild dots about hidden meanings, which I suppose is fitting considering Hunter's obsession with conspiracy theories. First, there's his name, with the obvious meaning behind the name Hunter, but then his surname, Onion, is just an apostrophe away from being onion, which can be used as a metaphor for the hidden layers of reality or conspiracy that can be peeled away to reveal even more layers. He also bears a superficial resemblance to Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, specifically with his hair and green shirt. Not to mention, he also drives a van that's a paint job and 4 flower hubcaps away from being the Mystery Machine. And intentional or not, the book subtly draws attention to the comparisons, with the bus driver in issue 0 telling Hunter there ain't no mystery here, and then again in issue 4 with Jimmy commenting that he's spooked like Scooby while the 3 are exploring the abandoned Nebraska bunker. I know I'm reaching here, but the Shaggy references are interesting to me because Shaggy was originally voiced by Casey Kasem, the same voice actor who provided voices for Cliffjumper, Blue Streak, and others in the G1 Transformers cartoon. Now, surely all of this is just a really weird coincidence and not an elaborate, overly convoluted nod to the G1 cartoon. But what if it's not? Another thing about Hunter, issue 1 opens with the briefest of glimpses into Hunter's life, highlighting his site, mechatopia.com. This was actually a real-life promotional website used by IDW to hype up Infiltration during the release of the book, although I'm not sure if there was ever anything substantial posted there, as the Wayback Machine only points to a single page with a broken image, but nonetheless, this little flashback shows Hunter's resolve and determination to uncover the truth. Hunter's obsession will come to have disastrous consequences for him personally, as we'll see in future books. And maybe that's why Mechatopia.com was never updated beyond the basic landing page. Moving on, Sunstreaker openly showing his distaste and irritation for the human cast of characters, besides this unintentionally mirroring some of the fan response at the time, also serves as subtle foreshadowing for future events. And while we're on the topic of the character, Sunstreaker's color palette in these early IDW stories is something of a conundrum to me. When we initially see him, he's yellow and black, like you'd expect, but from the very next page on and through to the end, he's colored yellow and blue. And maybe this should just be chalked up to a long-running error, or maybe it's an intentional attempt to replicate his color palette from the G1 Marvel comic, where black colors were often highlighted or replaced entirely with blue. I'm not sure, and don't ask me what the significance of that would be. But in any case, he'll continue to be yellow and blue for these early years until being toned down a little bit to be in line with similarly colored characters, and then will entirely revert to his traditional colors of yellow and black for All Hail Megatron. There are also a few little touches that I think plant this story firmly in the early 2000s, like Hunter's folder full of full website printouts. In my recollection of this time, it seems like almost everybody had a stack of internet printouts in a manila folder at one point or another during the late 90s and early 2000s. So that detail feels very of its time to me. Then there's the SM40 Palm computer, which Hunter's dialogue suggests it to be a top-of-the-line device for the time, which, I mean, I'm guessing even today's low-end smartphones could run circles around this thing, which just kind of adds to the time capsule feel. With nary a cell phone in sight, and online communities still in a nascent state. There's also a detail here where after Verity plugs the device into its portable modem, there's an onomatopoeia of what I think is supposed to be that horrendous dial-up modem sound. I also have to mention something that's kind of irritating to me, and that is the use of Cybertronian units of time. There's a lot of really good alien technobabble that Furman sprinkles in to add flavor, with my personal favorite producing the line, "Discorporate the null bubble," but they're all best left as just that, flavor, and nothing to be considered too deeply. And nowhere is that more essential than in the use of Cybertronian measurements of time. And here's why. In issue 5, while the humans are in the midst of escaping from the Nebraska bunker as Skywarp and Blitzwing work on destroying it, Starscream is preparing for his OR-13 power-up, meaning he likely starts the process around when the Nebraska bunker is totaled and Megatron is buried. By the start of issue 6, Astrotrain says Starscream's been inside the chamber for, quote, a whole megacycle. This would be fine if this megacycle in question was around the 2.6 hours megacycle from Transformers Animated or the around 1 hour megacycle from Beast Wars. All this stuff is detailed on TF Wiki, but no. Furman claimed in an old IDW post that a megacycle translated to roughly 93 hours. 93 hours.
What?
And we see on the very next page that Ratchet and the humans are still on the road to Lake Michigan and that they've traveled from an unspecified location in Nebraska to an unspecified location in Iowa in 93 hours. And you can't tell me they stopped along the way, because they are clearly still very dirty and disheveled from the Nebraska ordeal. You know, the whole thing makes me wonder, is there any chance that Furman meant 9.3 hours? Because that would be much, much better and make a lot more sense. Maybe he just forgot the decimal. Does this matter? No. Did it affect my enjoyment of the story? No. Does it lessen the overall experience? No. Is it extremely nitpicky? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. All I know is that taking 93 hours to travel from Nebraska to Iowa doesn't require suspension of disbelief so much as a shattering of disbelief, and pretty much made it so I never actually want to know what the specific units of Cybertronian time translate to in Earth time. Ever again. Don't care. It's possible there were a few points where the internal logic of this could have understandably broken down or needed to be stretched to the point of absurdity to best fit the flow of the story, but I think the real problem boils down to two things. One, defining these things at all when they should maybe just be left to the imagination and or reliant on context clues. And two, the extremely high number Furman attached to the term megacycle. In my opinion, we should all just agree that the values he provided all those years ago, while well-intentioned, just ended up creating more problems, may have been a mistake. In any case, they should just be ignored. Otherwise, we just run into the same problem again with Stormbringer, producing a battle that seems to be moving very quickly, but if you go by the time measurement, lasts again 93 hours, which is ridiculous. That's almost 4 days. Anyway, I'm gonna let it go now. I'm going to move on. I'm probably going to bring it up in the Stormbringer video, but for now I'm letting it go. So let's move on to the review for Infiltration, the first arc in IDW's Transformers saga. It's definitely a slow burn, taking its time to build and reveal the world Furman has conceived, one where the Autobots and Decepticons are committed to maintaining cover on the worlds that they invade. A result of this approach is that the series makes good on the whole robots in disguise concept that often gets shoved aside fairly quickly in other depictions. A substantial chunk of the action in Infiltration happens with the Autobots and Decepticons in their vehicular forms rather than their robot forms, although there starts to be much more of that later on as the series moves forward. Overall, this is a really promising start for a reimagined story of the conflict between the Autobots and Decepticons. This arc might be considered a little safe in terms of the basic premise, because how many times have we seen the Autobots and Decepticons fighting on Earth? And the roster is maybe not the most exciting, as it's comprised of a handful of the more popular characters from early Generation 1. With the exception of the Decepticon Battle Chargers, there's none of the deep-cut characters from later on in the history of the brand that I always love to see. Keeping Megatron and Optimus Prime off the board until later in the story helps offset this predictability somewhat. Still, it's worth keeping in mind that Furman would be introducing some of the more obscure characters soon enough, not to mention expanding on the solid foundations of this story in some pretty interesting ways. Ultimately, this arc is just setting the stage for much, much more to come. And a major element of that is front and center in the Mystery of Or-13, which will prove to be a foundational cornerstone of this continuity, both while Furman was the architect of all of the stories and in the years after when he was no longer involved. Although some immediate questions are answered within this story, like why the Decepticons relocated their command bunker and ultimately began to break infiltration protocol, broader mysteries that will be answered in future stories are seated here, such as where this ore that can conveniently be converted into a sort of super energon came from and why. So yes, Infiltration is definitely about setup, but I find it's an enjoyable arc in its own right. Sure, it's far from being a complete story with a strong resolution, but considering how often stories in superhero comics just go on and on and on in a perpetual second act due to their deeply commercial nature, it tempers my expectations somewhat. Maybe I've just read too many comics from this genre, or I have too low of expectations, but I don't really expect closure in ongoing comics like this. I become less concerned with the destination and tend to just enjoy the ride for what it is. And what it is, I think, is quite good. It's fully committed to its slow pace, grounded portrayal, and refusal to give you the copious giant robot action up front as you might expect, which definitely establishes a certain feel that you don't get in a lot of Transformers comics. The tone and methodical pacing of Furman's script is perfectly complemented by E.J. Sue's artwork, alternating between slower, calmer moments and quicker, more action-packed ones to great effect. Sue conveys a wealth of dynamic motion, tone, and emotion in his pages, regardless if there's any text on the page or not. Something I love about his work on this series are the moments when the sense of movement is manipulated in subtle yet striking ways, like in issue 3 when Ratchet asks Verity to give him the pocket device, which she does after much hesitation. You could easily get away with completing this action in 1 or maybe 2 panels, with the expression on Verity's face enough to show her reticence. But Sue stretches this out into 4 panels, showing Verity hesitating in the first one, reaching out to give the device in the second, having second thoughts and pulling away in the third, then surrendering the device in the 4th panel. This is admittedly a completely superfluous addition to the story. Sue didn't need to do this much to get the point across, but because he did, he turned a very mundane, forgettable action into a more memorable one, with much more emotional content and a little bit of humor than would otherwise be there. This moment almost feels more like something you'd expect to see in an indie comic rather than one centered around a Hasbro toy line. Now, I harbor no illusions about the crassly commercial nature of Transformers, but little moments like this help elevate the end product and overall storytelling. I'm guessing Sue liked this technique as well, as he returns to it throughout Infiltration. Another great use of it is at the beginning of issue 5, with Verity raising her scanner towards Megatron as the sound effect, signifying the bombing taking place above the bunker, rhythmically brings us closer and closer to her terrified expression, her courage simultaneously nearing its breaking point. These are certainly small, very specific moments, but Sue's work as a whole is just as good. In my opinion, he's an underrated craftsman, and I love what he brings to this series. Robots, humans, landscapes, architecture, he can do it all consistently well. Sure, some errors or bits of weirdness slip through here or there, but overall, I find his art to be tremendous. His redesigns of classic characters are great, and even when they adhere closely to the original character model, Sue adds a level of mechanical detail that makes all the Autobots and Decepticons visually interesting to look at, practically demanding that you stop reading to admire how detailed they can be at times. His humans are mostly just as good, with dynamic, expressive figure work. I do have to say that Verity ends up looking the most alive and expressive. For some reason, the male characters suffer from the whole Pat Lee dull surprise phenomenon, but I'd still take these humans over the early Dreamwave ones any day. And I suppose that's as good a place as any to transition to talking about the human characters in the story. While there are plenty of familiar faces amongst the Autobots and Decepticons, Infiltration is our introduction to an all-new cast of human characters created specifically for this continuity. To say this human cast was divisive is an understatement, as the letter pages of the Times attest, but I've never really understood the hate they got, and if it has to do with the way the characters are written, or if it's just down to the fact that there are human characters present in a Transformers story at all. I think it's safe to say that Verity is the main human protagonist during this arc, and she's not only given the most to do, but is given the richest characterization out of the three as well, both in the script by Furman and in the art by Sue. She also maintains the strongest thematic connection for a series that's focused on a hidden, unseen world beneath the facade of normalcy. As Furman points out in issue 0, all three of the human characters exist on the fringes of society, but I would argue Verity, a homeless orphan, even more so. Choosing to reject societal expectations and live life on her terms puts her into a world that's largely overlooked, if not outright ignored, giving her a degree of freedom to interact with society in unconventional ways, which ultimately lands her smack dab in the middle of the even more hidden reality of the Cybertronian invasion. It's maybe not the most meaningful thing in the world, but these little details regarding Verity and the humans add some welcome thematic depth. You could expand on that further with a related thematic component about characters not doing what's expected of them and the impact a strong-willed individual can have on a larger whole. Verity doesn't play by society's rules, which puts her in good company not only with Hunter and Jimmy, but also with Ratchet, who at multiple points disobeys Prowl's orders and the Autobot code of conduct, all for what he believes is right. This theme of the individual affecting the whole applies to Starscream as well, who is kind of the dark reflection of Ratchet in this story. Ratchet disobeys his superiors because he wants to save lives and doesn't think anyone is expendable, whereas Starscream defies Decepticon infiltration protocol and ultimately Megatron to fuel his own ambition for power, killing anyone that gets in his way to ensure he has the upper hand. All of these actions, even those done with the noblest of intentions, are not without consequences or effects. We can see some of that in this arc, with events escalating to the point that Megatron and Optimus become involved, but there will be more repercussions in future stories for the actions taken in this one. I don't think it's overstating it to say that there will be far-reaching consequences for some of these characters. To paraphrase Ratchet, nothing will ever be the same again. Not for the humans, and not for the Cybertronians. Anyway, that's about it for this inaugural video on Infiltration. I want to thank you for giving this a watch. I hope you got something out of it. Or, at the very least, I hope you found it entertaining. Let me know your thoughts on the video or the Infiltration miniseries in general. Did you pick this up when it came out in 2005? Or did you find it later, like I did? Do you like the pacing of the series, or do you find it kind of boring? And, of course, what do you think about Verity, Hunter, Jimmy, and the human characters in general? Whatever you got, let's talk Infiltration in the comments section. And, of course, if you want to follow along with the progress of this retrospective, consider subscribing so you can keep up to date when the videos drop. Until next time, have a good one.